And I hope you have a really good session. I've been looking forward to this all week. We've got a great panel, really interesting presentations, and the only way it'll be even better than it already is going to be is if you guys get engaged as well. So please do get in touch with the session. Enough blathering from me. I'm going to hand over to the hostess with the mostess, or Benjamin, as he's also known, who's going to chair the session.
Thank you very much for that, Sam. Actually, I'll pass that to you. So, really interesting session, absolutely packed room and beyond, and folks on the live stream as well. So I'm going to do my best as we're going along and chairing to keep an eye on what's going on the live stream. So for those people who are not in the room or who are feeling a little bit shy, do send your questions in via Twitter. I'm at Benjamin Ellis on Twitter and have a kind of very passionate interest in this subject. As the panel introduce themselves, what you'll see is that we've got a range of different perspectives on what is a massive topic. The silent revolution, if you like, behind social media has been to create an environment where there is more data about what we're doing, who we're doing it with, and where we're doing it than there ever has been at any other point in history. And for those of us who are, in varying degrees, professional people watchers, be it psychologists or business people, it's a really fascinating time as we start to look and explore that data. You'll hear today about work that's done in lab environments, that's done in what we lovingly call the field environment, and then also how things are being used in a practical business context. My background, for people not familiar with me, is a geek originally by trade, then drifted into the wonderful world of marketing, and more recently over the last kind of 5 to 7 years working in the area of psychology, co-founder of a business called SocialOptic, which is really about visualizing that data in the business context to look at the informal networks inside of a business and how that maps to the commitment. So I'm thinking about this day to day, but it is a massive area. We're not going to be able to explore everything, but you will guide the conversation through your questions. We're going to have 2 formal presentations, and then we'll open it up to Q&A and debate, so have your questions ready. I'm going to get the panel to introduce themselves. If we start with Nathalie, and we'll hand the mic down.
Hey everyone, how are you doing? Quiet, you're doing quiet. Good, hi.
It's the food.
My name's Nathalie Nahai. I'm the Web Psychologist. You might know me on Twitter as the Web Psych. My background's in psychology and web design, and I'm currently writing a book on the psychology of online influence for Pearson, and that's going to be coming out in October this year. And you might see that I was a bit sneaky and put a bunch of sort of questions on your chairs. I'm doing a bit of research to see what you guys are doing to create online influence for yourselves and for your businesses. And I'm really interested to hear what you have to say. And also, as a little thank you, everyone who does submit a comment will have your name in the thank you section at the beginning of my book. So it's a bit about who I am, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
Influenced by fame.
Hello, I'm Martin, and I'm a caveman, I suppose, and that's my position on this panel, because it is a meeting of Cavemen Anonymous, isn't it? I think that was my assumption. But that may seem an odd thing to say, but I think it's important to remind ourselves that really, basically, we are the same, got the same sort of brain, same sort of instincts as people who came out of Africa 100,000 years ago. And I think my particular angle on this sort of debate and what we think about at Draft FCB is about what makes people make decisions. We have a decision-making institute, indeed, working with Berkeley and Stanford and various other academic institutions and various neuroscientists, indeed, just to understand a bit more about what makes people make decisions. And a lot of those actually aren't as rational as we think. They're quite intuitive. And that's what I'm hopefully going to bring to this debate, is to sort of think from that sort of angle. So it may not be the most sophisticated contribution, but I'll give you the caveman's angle on it.
Hey everyone, my name's David Stillwell. I'm the founder of the My Personality social network application that runs on Facebook. It allows people to take a personality test and then get scientific feedback on their results. Something like 6 million people have taken that test, so we've got a huge database. So I use it in academic research at the University of Cambridge Psychometric Centre, where I'm a research associate, and also in Cambridge Personality Research, which is kind of a spin-out from this data to use it in the marketing context.
Thanks. So my name is Azeem Azhar. I'm the founder of a company called Peer Index. We help consumers understand and benefit from their influence. by making sure that brands know who they are and can reward them appropriately.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Azeem. So hopefully that gives you a feel for what we have in store. I'm going to hand over to Nathalie to take the stand.
Grab my glass of water.
Yes.
Sorry.
Right, so psychology of online influence. We've got an amazing panel today, and I'm sure we're all going to approach this topic from our own different disciplines. So the way in which I'd like to approach it is through the field of web psychology. Now, at the moment, you'll probably all have different interests in adjacent fields that study how we are influenced by our digital environments in terms of how they can get us to behave or act in certain ways. But there's no single umbrella field that pulls in the research from the areas of human-computer interaction in user experience and neuroaesthetics. And that's what I'm trying to do with web psychology, is to create a point of convergence that can bring in all of that kind of research. So anything that looks at how to subconsciously influence the way that we behave and interact online. So I define it as the empirical study of how our digital environments influence our attitudes and our behaviours. And that's quite a broad umbrella, but we're going to have a look at what it comprises. So these are some of the fields that I've looked at in terms of the research that's being generated. And in this particular talk, we're going to have a look at neuroaesthetics. So neuroaesthetics is the neuroscientific way of looking at the way in which we respond to our visual and aesthetic environment. So that can be video, it can be two-dimensional images, it can be our environment like you all sitting here looking at me talking today and me looking at you. And they use things like EEGs and fMRI scans to look at the level of activity at a brain level. And one of the benefits that this has over qualitative data, over people saying what their preferences are, is that we all qualify our experiences based on what we think we know. And a lot of the ways in which we respond to things happen at a subconscious level. And it's not that we're lying about it, it's just that we generally don't know why we might respond to certain things, like the colour blue. Well, we'll have a certain response to that versus red. And why would this be interesting if you're running an online business? Well, you can use information and research from the field of neuroaesthetics to help you iteratively refine the kind of visual media that you're putting out there and interacting with your audience with. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, so I want to talk you through an advert that does this really well. You probably haven't seen it, but it was on a program recently called What Makes a Masterpiece on Channel 4. Did anyone watch that? No. Okay, really worth finding. I don't think it's up on the iPlayer anymore, but you might be able to find it in the archives. Basically, there's an advert by Birdseye, and they have this image. The original was the image of a man in jeans, rolled up around his ankles and his shirt, walking along a beach, naked feet, and he's talking about the abundance of Mother Nature and the blue sky and the horizon. It's all very romantic and about fresh fish. And the original advert basically pauses, so all you can see eventually is him walking slowly across the scene. Everything else is still. So someone's freeze-framed everything except this man's walking. And then he says, simply capture this moment. And at that point, everything is still. The music in the background is suspended, there's silence, and you just are left there to look at this image. It's quite odd, right? Well, then suddenly everything goes back into motion. You hear the music again, the movie starts playing again, and then it goes off to Birdseye, and then it gives you the big slap-up advert at the end. Now, what the neuroaesthetics team did was to add a single scene that made a massive difference in their recall of the advert, 40% recall increase, and in the increase of their sales. What did they do? Well, at the point at which they freeze-framed the image, they inserted an extra scene, which was of a shoal of fish under the sea, slowing down with sunlight streaming through. Again, it was all blue. And instead of, in the first advert, freezing on the guy, just freezing on the fish meant that we were subconsciously taking in that image and capturing that image of the fish and making the association with their product. The other things that they didn't mention in the TV program, which they used, were embedded commands. Are any of you familiar with hypnosis? Okay, so with an advert like this, where they're trying to instill a sense of calm and serenity, one of the ways in which you can influence people is to give them an embedded command. So once they're relaxed, you say, now simply capture this moment. And that's the command, capture this moment. And pairing that with the image of the fish, you then have a higher recall. So there's other elements. The other thing they did was to use a blue landscape, which, as we're going to see in a moment, is a universally favorite color across whatever culture you're from, and it has a very calming influence on the image that we see. So again, inducing kind of a trance-like state. So a piece of research that was done a little while ago was looking at the way in which we respond to two-dimensional images, to art. And these two researchers found that universally we tend to prefer blue landscapes, so landscapes that have a lot of sky or a lot of sea, and that we tend to prefer natural environments that haven't been tampered with by humans. So anything that mirrors the savannah, which is our sort of ancestral environment coming through now, is the kind of image that we still prefer today. And with the exception of one country, people tend to like children playing in the foreground and then an icon of their national identity, so like a flag, with the exception of one country, which is France, and they prefer naked women. So you can use that in your sites if you're targeting a French audience, but unless you're doing porn, I probably wouldn't advise it. So a little test. Of these three images, which one do you think gets the biggest response from your brain? Which one do you think you respond to the strongest? So hands up for the photograph on the left. Hands up. Who thinks? And how about the image in the middle? Okay, and what about the image on the end? All right, marginally more for the image on the end. It was probably about 30-40 split there, I think. Interestingly, the image on the end gets the largest response when you're measuring the brain activity through EEG and fMRI machines, which is ridiculous, right? Because you'd have thought in our natural environment, we don't go around looking like that. But the reason that we prefer that image was explained in a study by a leading neurologist, Ramachandran, and a philosopher, William Herstein, who looked at the aesthetic principles behind, behind beauty. And they found, really weirdly, that obviously we like contrast, but that also we process things much better in a single visual mode, which means that if we reduce the amount of information that we're taking in to black and white, the brain has a lot more resources to be able to process that image more quickly. It's like RAM. You've got a limited amount of RAM. You give it loads of programs to run, it's going to clog it up. You give it less data to process, it happens more quickly. They also found something odd called the peak shift effect. Now, this comes from the study of evolutionary biology. Let's give you an example of what it means. There was a study that was done on a particular kind of seagull whose mother, well, all of them have red dots at maturity, but the mother had a red dot on the end of her beak, and to elicit a behavior for feeding, the chick would see the red dot, and then it would tap the mother's beak. Okay, that's what happens in nature. What the scientists did was to get a stick with a red dot, and they elicited the same behavioral response from the chick. So they said, all right, so it's got to be either the beak or the red dot that they're responding to. So they ran some trials, and they found that it was the dot. They then went and painted 2 red dots on the stick, which elicited an even larger behavioral response from the chick, even though you don't get 2 red dots in nature. And then they increased it to 3, and the behavior was even more, which is just very, very strange. And that's what the peak shift effect is. And that's why, if you get an image of Bill Clinton, full-color photograph, and you hold that up next to a caricature, your brain will recognize the caricature much more quickly than it will the photograph because of these core principles, which sounds very odd, but it seems to be the case. So I don't want to sort of spend too much time talking at you. I'd like to hear what you guys have to say. So I'll just recap on why these things might be handy for your work on the online environment. One of them is that if you care to find them, there are universal principles of aesthetics that you can apply in your work. Number 2 is that you can use existing research to create better visual imagery to engage with your audience. And number 3 is once you have access to this research and this knowledge, you can implement it and then A/B test your work in order to get a refined product that then you can take to market and create more impact with. Right, so I mentioned this at the beginning with the book. It's coming out in October, but I want to know how you create online influence, and I would love to know what your thoughts are. So if you can write down on the little piece of paper, there are some pens going around, which has my old branding on it, so ignore the branding. But if you'd like to fill it in, please do, and I'll collect them at the end. And I think that's it. And feel free to tweet at me for the rest of the day, because I'll be here, and come and grab me afterwards. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Nathalie. Well, get David to come up. So, it's the old adage in a way that less is more. We're a different perspective now as we go through, and Dave brings up his slides. And my kind of personal discovery going through this stuff for the last kind of 5-6 years is just quite how much of the things are very counterintuitive. When you actually sit down and measure things, the set of results that you get are very different than what you would intuitively think they're going to be. And this is a pretty large data set to look at that David's going to talk about here.
Great. So as I said before, I run the My Personality social network application. That's what it looks like on Facebook. So it's been running since June 2007. It allows Facebook users to take real psychological questionnaires used in actual scientific research, used in my research, used in something like 20 other different research groups who are collaborating with us around the world. But for the user's perspective, they receive feedback on their results. So, you know, people like going to magazines and taking these fake personality tests that someone made up. So we were thought, you know, why not give people a real personality test? And 6.5 million people have taken this test since June 2007. So it seems to work. People seem to like it. It's still used by hundreds of people every day. Not just one personality test. We've got something like 25 different reliable and valid questionnaires on there, from the sort of big 5 personality, 5 traits that make up the kind of the real you, happiness, stuff like IQ, even stuff with sort of, you know, how much you know about giving birth for the women. So sort of, you know, very different questionnaires on there. But as part of that, users can also opt in to sharing their Facebook profile data with us. So as I say, it's an opt-in, they don't have to. And if they do opt in, then we say, you know, we'll use this in our research, but you'll be made anonymous. No one's ever going to contact you and say, you've filled in this questionnaire, we know you're an extrovert, you know, we're going to try and sell you something. And about 30 to 40% of people do that. So we've got a huge database of people's personality, and then the things that they do on Facebook. So if you think about what's on Facebook, there's a lot of stuff. Not only your age and gender, which is great for us because we don't have to ask people that kind of boring information. We can just kind of pull it. But also the things that you've clicked like on, the number of friends you have, who your friends are, whether your friends are friends with each other. So kind of a really rich and interesting database for not just psychologists, but social psychologists, social scientists from across the range, from kind of computer science, psychology to business and things like that. So that's my only slide. I'm hoping to do a demo now, which is ambitious, but we'll see. Okay, so one of the things that we've done with this database is, as I say, we've got data on personality and the things that people like. And that allows us to say, basically, the personality of the people who like BMW is this, and the personality of the people who like Porsche is that. So then, you know, we thought this was interesting for research, but then marketers were coming to us and saying, you know, we want this information, we're interested in these kinds of insights, what can you tell us about our customers? So we created a spin-off, which is called Cambridge Personality Research, which basically takes this data and finds commercial applications for it. So let me just log in. So this is being used already by a number of Facebook marketing agencies. So far, the average, so what it's used for is for ad targeting. So we say, well, they come along and they say, I'm advertising this product. And then we can tell them the personality of the people who like that product. And we can also tell them where to find more people with that personality who would likely fit into that product. So, you know, people have already done this with gender, for example. You don't sell romantic comedies on, you know, movies that are all about Arnold Schwarzenegger. You know, they just don't match up. But the same thing applies to various personality traits. So just a sort of very simple example to start off with. This is the people who like Mitt Romney and the people who like Newt Gingrich. So these are US presidential hopefuls in the Republican Party. So what you can see is that, well, what I can hope you can see is that openness, which is the top trait there. So that distinguishes people who are kind of liberal, they like to try new things, new foods, from people who are traditional. Sort of, you know, they like the old ways. So both of those people, not surprisingly, fairly traditional, because Republican, fairly traditional party. Conscientiousness, again, both of them very similar for conscientiousness. So conscientiousness is kind of people who are organized, hardworking, people who you want in your business, versus kind of impulsive, spontaneous people. So both of they're sort of fans, very conscientiousness, high for conscientiousness. And then I'll just take stability at the bottom. So they're both similar there. So stability, again, is kind of people who are relaxed, very difficult to stress out, versus people who are kind of, the positive way is to say they're in touch with their emotions. So these are people these are people who you don't want to be running in a sort of a stock exchange environment where there's lots of things happening. They just get stressed out, it's too much for them. So again, both of their fans, very traditional. What's different between the two, and might be interesting for their campaign people, is that the people who like Mitt Romney are fairly outgoing, versus Newt Gingrich, which are fairly introverted. So that's the extroversion, the third one down. So then agreeableness is kind of people who are interested in social cohesion. So they like to work in teams, they like when everyone gets on together, versus people who are more competitive and assertive, and they like to be leaders. So the Mitt Romney fans are more sort of getting on, let's all get on, versus Newt Gingrich, which are more near the middle. But what I wanted to talk about in this talk, since it's sort of social influence, is we've also got information on the number of friends that the followers of these people have. So let me just get that up. Silly thing. There we go. Okay, so friends number here. So Newt Gingrich, the fans of Newt Gingrich are a lot more well connected on Facebook. So we know that the number of friends that people have on Facebook doesn't necessarily match their even just their Facebook influence. There's sort of a number of other factors involved. But as a sort of an interesting starting point, it's quite interesting to look at this. So, as I say, Newt Gingrich fans a lot more well connected, more friends than Mitt Romney fans. So the surprising thing for us when we looked at these, the things that people like and the number of friends that they have on average, is that there's sort of a surprising difference between them. So it's not as if, if you're on the left side, you have 20 fewer friends than if you're on the right side. It's literally double the number of friends if you like certain things than if you like other things. So I'll just give some examples of high and low friend numbers. So we can do a search for people who have a high number of friends. So I'll just put that on 85. So the sort of 85th percentile is about 380 Facebook friends on average. So you can see, let me make all 100 appear. So you can see Twitter at the top there. So people who like Twitter on Facebook are well connected, which kind of fits in with the view of people who use social media are more connected than people who don't. You can see some sort of well-known things like Edward Cullen. I'm not sure how he fits in. So he's the guy in Twilight, right? You can see drunk texting, bring it on, beer pong. So they're kind of extroverted things. Not surprisingly, extroverted people have more friends. And what was the other thing I wanted to point out? There was political science, which interested me. So that says something about politics. If you're interested in politics, you probably need lots of friends. So, as I say, these guys have got, on average, 380 friends. So then we can do, for low numbers of friends, I'll just put that on 5%. Does it search again? So lots and lots of books and sort of computer games and things. So Dragon Age, Portal, Fallout, New Vegas, BioWare, Camelot, which is a musical group. So kind of lots of introverted things, opposite of the extroverted things, again, kind of makes sense. What also amused me from this list was pantaloons up there. So I was hoping that there was some kind of causal relationship. People who like pantaloons, you know, they're friends of, not friends anymore. But it turns out that Pantaloons is an Indian clothing company, clothing website. So you can also see Indian cricket team and a few Channel V India. So there's also a kind of a cultural thing. So for some reason on Facebook, Indians seem to have fewer friends. There's the opposite for Malaysians. So for some reason, Malaysians are more connected on Facebook. And that might tell us something sociological about the way that, you know, the different social groups work in different countries. My understanding from my Malaysian friends is that, you know, just sort of meeting someone is enough to add them as a friend on Facebook. So, you know, this is useful for marketers in that if you're selling something, why not target the people who have lots of friends? I mean, it's not a perfect indicator of their social influence, and I'm sure we'll talk about, you know, all the other reasons that people have social influence, not just down to number of friends. But if you're going to target on Facebook, you know, go for the likes, the people who like the things that indicate that they have lots of friends. I thought it might be interesting to take a couple of suggestions from the floor. If anyone wants to look up something sort of very quickly to see if it's popular or not, some kind of, you know, relatively large brand. Volunteers. Nokia. Oh dear. I'm hoping it's high. Or at least let's put Nokia and let's put iPhone. All right, so here's Nokia and iPhone. We get rid of Mitt Romney and Newt Gingrich.
Well, could you do Apple instead of iPhone? Because iPhone, you've got such a small sample size and it's going to be richer people.
Okay, so we'll see Apple. Pineapple Express, Apple Incorporated. All right, we can have both on there and see if they're similar. All right, so personality-wise, relatively similar across all 5 domains, actually, which is kind of good for us in that it suggests, you know, people who like phones are fairly similar. So here's the demographics. Friends number. Okay, so people who have iPhones have more friends than people who like iPhone on Facebook have more friends than people who like Nokia. But then Apple is similar to Nokia. So there might be something here in that an iPhone is an actual phone and the other two are companies. But you know, we've got something like 150,000 objects in this database. So you know, marketing people, we can help. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. I'm going to get the panel to take their seats. Up there. So hopefully you start to see some context now. And you'll start to pick up some of the challenges in the work and in working in this area. I think for many of the, you know, I think people in this room will probably be divided between 2 ends of the spectrum. One is in what I would call operationalizing this work. So, you know, what can we actually do with this? And the other end, kind of creating the data and researching it. And the conflict between those, I'm sure, will come up a little bit as we talk through this. So I've got questions, but I'm obviously going to open up for questions from the floor. So if you've got a question, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand, and I'll try and spot people. There will be a mic that goes around. So, okay, cool. We'll wait. So my kind of first question for the panel is the issue around kind of observing versus operationalizing. So it's quite easy to create things in a well-defined environment like a lab where we can sit down, measure something, change it, and see what the impact is again. The challenge in the real world is that recreating those things is very difficult, and there are so many other kind of compounding factors. What's the linkage, and where do things start to break down between what we can look at and measure versus how we can actually apply that and start to predict what would happen and what's going to work? I'll get people to use marks. Yeah, go on, Nathalie. Start. Oh, go on. David, start with them. It is a classic then question. Just me. Sorry.
Well, I can't answer it. Is this on? Hello? Hello? Yeah, I mean, you've raised a really important question, which is how do you translate, lab-oriented experiments into things that are practical. I think some of the stuff Nathalie raised demonstrated how you can start to do that with colours, for example. But I think we do also have a real-life set of observations that we can look at. So there are limitations to looking at behavior on Twitter or on Facebook or LinkedIn or Pinterest. But these things are very, very large-scale data sets. And within the constraints of what they're telling you, there are some statistical behaviors that we know are generally the case. So this idea of the central limit theorem, which is if you sample enough people, you'll generally start to reflect how the population behaves, is quite a powerful one. And that's why we're starting to see companies be able to make predictions on market share by looking at the volume of tweets that might mention Apple, iPhone versus Android. And you can start to make those predictions. Now, they're not necessarily, what we're not looking at are causalities, and you're not necessarily able to say, this person, Bob, is now going to switch from an iPhone to an Android in the next 3 months. But you might be able to make population guesses and population estimates. I think what's really exciting about what's happening within the social platforms is that they're providing us with so much data that if you've got good mathematicians, you can start to make some sense of it and start to make some predictions out of it. It's like a real world lab that doesn't necessarily suffer from the observer paradox, which is the moment we start to observe you, we become part of the experiment. But I've got a real scientist next to me. He'll probably tell you something different.
Well, is this... Yep. So, I mean, certainly our experience with my personality data is that everything we look at from personality collected on a social network, which is, at least as far as academics go, as real as it gets, it seems to mirror the same findings we find in the lab. So, we expect that extroverts would have more friends. That's what we find. It's interesting that people, before you find it, people say, oh, maybe social networks will be different. And then after you find it, they say, well, of course it was like that, So, I mean, certainly what I come from in my personality is that there's no sort of... We can have the benefit of both. I mean, we can do kind of fairly controlled lab studies, but in a huge wide setting. So some of the other sort of stuff that I'm doing with companies like Microsoft Research is looking at can we put some of these things that are typically in a lab, but can we put them on social networks, on websites? And can we essentially run our small-scale studies that we normally do, fairly controlled, but in a huge wide setting with thousands of people participating? So I think we can sort of at least come closer together in getting the best of both worlds.
Maybe I can add a thought to that. I mean, what we found when we're trying to solve problems for clients is often it is best just to try things and see if they work or not, and do what we call a minimum viable product. So we try and get something. We identify what the problem is with the customer, and we come up with hypotheses that might answer that. Then we try and release something as what we call a minimum viable product, and really try and measure everything that happens after that, and try and iterate that product, increase things that are working, decrease things that are not. And that seems to have had some success for us on a few projects with things like findanyfilm.com, which is a site for UK film industry, and various other projects we've been involved with. There's actually quite an interesting book, which I have to confess I haven't read all of yet, but called Everything is Obvious by Duncan Watts. I don't know if people are familiar with that. But he sort of has a go at Malcolm Gladwell's idea about the tipping point, and basically says, well, you can't predict anything anyway, so best to just you post-rationalise afterwards whether it's right or not. And I think that's quite an interesting view, but I don't know if other people on the panel agree with that. Sorry, another question.
Did you want to ask another question?
Well, can I come back to this point about Malcolm Gladwell? I mean, it was a really interesting book, The Tipping Point. So how many people have read The Tipping Point? Well, congratulations to those of you who didn't fall for it. How many of you read The Tipping Point because somebody recommended it to you?
Yeah.
Only Sam. Okay. Well, you're the influenceable one. We'll be talking later. I mean, I think that there was something interesting about what Gladwell did, which was, he kind of constructed a story that wasn't really based on any maths. And it launched a set of ideas and mavens and connectors and all of that kind of podunk. And Duncan Watts is quite right in saying, hold on a second, when we actually look at the data, we don't really see this happening. You can tell a really nice story about some bloke on a horse in 1776, but it doesn't reflect what really happens. But I think the thing that you have to be very careful about is to then jump to the conclusion that it's not possible to predict how to make predictions about the way in which memes will spread or the way in which people will influence other people to buy a new product or change their beliefs. Because we know that there is other maths, and I think to sort of debunk an entire stream of very, very robust science because a journalist wrote the wrong book in 1997 is sort of naive, right? We know epidemiologists are studying and modeling how diseases spread, and we're taking those studies and saying, well, how do memes spread? How do people start to use particular words? How do people start to buy products? How do Egyptian protesters start to go out into the streets at particular times? And there are models, mathematical models that we can use that aren't alluded to by Gladwell. Yes, you can chuck Gladwell out without chucking out the science of influence.
No, I mean, I wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, there's a guy called Dan Ariely, who other people might also know, and he's someone who we have some dealings with in the Institute of Decision Making, and he talks about predictably irrational, I think, isn't it? So we are quite irrational. We are cavemen, as I said at the beginning, and that can mean sometimes our decisions don't seem that rational. You can have every single good rational argument for doing something, and then you go and do something completely different because someone happened to mention to you who you knew, who had overwhelmed that influence and caused you to do something else. So obviously that's an opportunity in social media, particularly, and for things that are social, local and mobile, those sort of opportunities to nudge people in the right direction. So predictably irrational seems like gives us hope that we can do certain predictive work, but I think always remembering that it's not until you really test things for real that you really understand what's going on and how best to adapt it, and taking that more beta approach to things is certainly something we try and do.
Okay, so I'm looking out for a question. So I've got a question at the front row here, which we'll take. We'll get the mic to there. Just quickly, while we're getting to that, I've got a very quick question, which is, there's kind of two levels that these things can operate at, which people miss. One is at the individual level. We've talked a little bit about that. The other is at a more social level. So kind of my declared interest, I'm more of a discursive psychologist. So my kind of viewpoint is that actually a lot of what happens is, as you describe, the stories that are created around things, and things operate at that level. And any kind of quick views on, if we're looking at influence, do we look at individuals? Do we look at broader things? Do we have to look at both? How do they impact on each other?
I think one thing that's interesting about that question that connects with the previous one is that every time we look at new platforms that allow us to connect, to influence, the same questions come up. We always talk about numbers first, like MySpace. We go, oh my God, who can have the biggest number? It's always the biggest, the best, etc. And then what we find is once you become comfortable with that form of communication, whether that's telegrams or phones or radios or TVs or mobiles or iPads or whatever, every single technological improvement that we end up having, we subvert it towards gratifying our social impulse, which we've always had and will probably always have unless we end up lobotomized, which is, well, I don't know, with this new group of kids coming up already plugged in, things might change. But I think in terms of influence and predicting how people respond at a group level and at a personal level, they might be exaggerated. Those behaviors and the ways in which we go about influencing and interacting may be exaggerated by our online platforms, but we can only revert back to what we know and what we're capable of, like Dunbar's number. I know he's talking here later, I think. We're only wired to be able to behave in certain limited capacities. Therefore, the previous behaviors that we've exhibited are likely to be expressed probably in a new way, but in a similar way to how they always have been. That's my thought. thought on the matter.
Cool.
Oh, no, please.
Different.
There's some kind of thing going on. Yeah. There's a great book by a guy who's now at Facebook called Paul Dawson called Grouped, and actually he is from Ireland or the UK, and it's very much worth reading because he touches on a lot of these issues, which is that at some level there's a lot of context about the way in which we end up influencing and being influenced by other people, that the atomic unit of influence might not be the individual, it might be the group, and it may be that groups switch, convert in different ways, that it may be more valuable to break down your target audience into a series of overlapping groups of friends or communities and triggering them all a certain step at a time. It's a little bit like, I guess, the difference between Plaxo and LinkedIn when they were growing. Plaxo took this view that what you needed to do was infect as many people as you could with the Plaxo virus very, very early on, whereas LinkedIn took a very steady state view, which was, over a period of time, let's get people getting their entire professional circles on LinkedIn. And what ended up happening was that Plaxo sent out very many more invites. But of course, over the long term, it's LinkedIn that has won out with 110 million users and so on. And if you look at the way that Facebook grew, Facebook influenced in a very, very similar way. They found these groups that were very, very coherent, which was kids at Barnard College and kids at Bryn Mawr College. And they held themselves within these groups and stepped over a group at a time. And if you look at epidemics, the way in which epidemics tend to spread tends to follow the same sort of patterns. So you're actually, in many ways, you're better off thinking in terms of perhaps groups as the atomic unit rather than individuals, which is often the way that we've thought about this.
Just a sort of a tangential point about sort of whether it's an individual level or a social level. So one piece of research I've done recently is on happiness. So can your personality predict how happy you are? Yes. In fact, your personality predicts how happy you are about 30% of how happy you are. Compared to how much money you have, which predicts it, minuscule percent, 3-4%. So your personality is really important. But then we went using the Facebook data and we said, okay, what about the aggregate personality of where you live? So we looked at US states, and some US states are kind of different from each other. Some of them are more open. California keeps voting Democratic, whereas Mississippi votes Republican. So there are differences between the states on the personality variables. So then we said, if you're an extrovert living in an extroverted state, or perhaps an extrovert living in an introverted state, will you be happier or less happy than you would be if we just take your individual personality into account? So then what we find is that extroverts are happy in introverted states, and introverts are happy in extroverted states. And the same thing applied for openness. Open people are happy surrounded by other open people. And then traditional people with traditional people. So you definitely get more information by looking at both levels. And of course, but to do that, you need huge data sets, which is where social media, the internet, comes in handy. Yeah,
and everything that's interesting, the amount of data out there now, some of the early studies that you've heard people mention here took years to put together and were based on a couple of hundred people in a specific environment. We can now look at millions and millions of data points. We could take that question from the second row there.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether my question might have already been partially answered, actually, but apologies for a multi-part question. But we hear a lot about gamification these days and measurement through social data of people's activity. And on a personal level or on a brand level, bigger is better, an escalation of influence and trying to become top dog. Do you think that the total amount of influence is increasing? So is there an ever rising amount of everyone influencing everyone else, and we're all sort of in an arms race of influence, or do you think it's just changing?
Wow, okay, great questions. Yeah, I've got in my head the idea of an influence budget now, got an influence index.
Panel? To anyone in particular?
Yeah,
That's a bloody good question, actually. It's a great question. So let's just think about the way in which people might make a white goods purchase. So I'm old enough to remember that 20 years ago, what I would have done is get a copy of Which from Southend Library and looked at the Which from 6 months before to fridge freezers. And that would have narrowed down my choice to 2 or 3. And then I would have gone to the LEC showroom, the electricity company showroom, and taken a look at it with my mum and made a choice. And essentially, Which was the primary influence in that process. Now, today, what would happen is my process would be very, very loopy. What wouldn't have featured would have been any adverts in the papers or the iPad apps. But certainly what would have featured would have been a trip to Amazon and Review.com and a search for what's a great fridge freezer for a family with no space in their house. And potentially I might have put a call out to Twitter saying, anyone got a good fridge freezer who knows me, and got some recommendations. And then I would have gone around that, probably trading off the 2 best against some price and delivery cost kind of attributes. And that's probably a relatively common process, right? So people like McKinsey have looked at this. So your question is there a fixed influence budget? And the answer is, I'm not really sure. I'm not going to extemporize an answer to that, but the process has definitely changed. Which doesn't feature at all, but Review is basically Which. Advertising doesn't feature at all, but there are many, many more points of potential influence to my purchasing. So if you're then the brand manager of Electrolux thinking about this, you actually need to do much more than just make sure that Which has reviewed your freezer, right? You need to make sure that there are as many of these touch points end up being covered by people who can talk authentically about your product, which is an interesting challenge.
I think maybe to add something to that, I wouldn't disagree with anything there, but our route to purchase is quite interesting because I think we all are desperate to be rational people. And we love this idea of going to all these sites and reviewing it and getting all the facts and figures. And actually, when it boils down to it, 95% of our decisions aren't driven by rational mind at all. It's driven by more emotional or intuitive factors. So it's those that are going to outweigh a lot of other things. So in terms of, I'm not sure I think, taking us back to the cavemen again, it is that we take shortcuts to deal with complexity. And that might be someone might just say, hey, well, I used it and I thought it was rubbish. In which case, everything you've read is wiped out. So there are things that just massively outweigh. And I think that's... so I don't think we can necessarily deal with the complexity of these things. I think it could be just one of these many trigger points that is the one that is the one. But I'm not sure we weigh up more factual things. I think we very much buy and then justify afterwards. And that's really, might want to influence some of the ways we market products, actually, because it's much more of an emotional thing. And if you really want to justify it all, put it on the packaging or something, I don't know, deliver it afterwards, because people may need to go home and explain to their partner why they bought it. And that's probably the most useful bit for it.
Yeah. I think definitely for people who work in the B2B marketing space, I mean, a huge amount of the effort that goes in is people building evidence to justify the decision that they'd already made, whether that's at a conscious or an unconscious level, and kind of providing materials for that. In terms of that question, I think it's interesting to think about it as 2 parts. Potentially, one is the process of influencing, and the other is the process of being influenced. And so there's a question about, do we have a limited capacity to be influenced? I think the other end of the influencing equation, it's interesting, the business space, just like the consumer space, the data that we look at is social graph inside of business and influence around decision points. And certainly what we've seen even in the number of years that we've been running the business is a shift from somebody working in an organisation where they maybe have a manager and a dotted line manager and a couple of other people they interact with around the decision. So essentially when I look at decision influences, small number of people, now some of the organisations we're working with, an employee is in like 6, 7, 8 virtual teams, and when you map the influence on them, you've got 24 to 30 people who are influencing the decision that they're about to make. So from the point of view of the influencer, their effect is diluted because they're competing with lots of different people. It's no longer the boss going, do this. It's now an employee kind of balancing all these conflicting demands on what it is that they should or shouldn't do, and kind of balancing that. Whether that means they're more or less influenced, or whether they have a finite capacity to be influenced is a very good question.
Does that make them less happy? I mean, is that like the mustard choice in the supermarket?
So I think one of the things about influence, and I'll take another question, is thinking about things that conflict and things that compete. So somebody in the business context, a lot of things that we look at, if I'm telling you to make something blue and somebody else is telling you to make something red, then what I'm managing is a conflict. And so that influence piece, if you like, is about managing the politics between two people. If I've got two people asking me to do a very similar thing but at different points in time, then actually they're kind of potentially contending. They don't conflict with each other. So actually, influence is very multifaceted. I think it's one of the things that's hopefully coming across here. It's not a straight, do you make somebody do something? It's about where that happens, what that thing is. So really my point within that is that in a business where people get unhappy is where they can't resolve those. So if you're caught in the middle of two things that you can't resolve, and the people that you're trying to resolve it with can't resolve, in a way, if you think about a business, everybody is a hop on a network of being influenced. So again, we often think about influence as a kind of an endpoint, but actually you think about it, you're being influenced by brands, and then you're influencing other people about brands. In the business, you're being influenced to make a decision, and you're influencing other people. Where it starts to hurt and make you unhappy is where those influences start to get back pressure and become at odds with each other. It's uncomfortable. I don't know how that works in the consumer space, but we definitely see that pattern in business. If you want to predict whether a business is happy or not, it's actually kind of decouple all the influence and look at how aligned the needs are of the senior management team. That will tell you how happy the business is, because that propagates out into influence of people trying to do conflicting things, if that makes sense.
Maybe there's a point as well about how things vary across the world is quite an interesting area as well. Because I'm not sure all societies are as open to influence as perhaps the US or UK. I think that's an important thing to remember. We operate globally, and we find there are distinct differences in different parts of the world. And there's a guy who, again, we deal with called Richard Nesbitt, written something called The Geography of Thought, and he does talk about independent societies and interdependent societies. And independent societies tend to trust us to closer circle, whereas our sort of societies, will believe strangers very happily. And I think there is some cultural difference there in influence, and perhaps there's more potential for influence growth in societies such as ours in the US, perhaps less so if you go some of the Asian cultures.
Okay, I'm going to attempt to take two questions. So if we have a mic on the end of the row here, and a mic back there as well. So it's just coming towards you. Can we just say your name before your question? That'd be great.
My name's Eva. I've got a frog in my throat. What's this actually doing to our brains? Are we evolving slightly differently, and what effect is this going to have on our personalities? And also, people behave differently online. So we've got avatars, we've got made-up names. And while you say they might be extrovert, actually I think loads of people I know are introverts who suddenly become extroverts online. So there is a sort of switch over from real life to online. I just wonder what you guys thought of that.
Cool.
I think there's a really, really interesting piece on that, because there's a lot of evidence to support different theories. I read recently about how on Facebook, it came out in a couple of different papers, but it was on APS, which pull in like psychological journals. And it was talking about how people on Facebook who are introverted, because they're anonymous to an extent in the sense that they're not standing in front of all of their peers, because they perceive themselves to be anonymous, they'll go and post negative status updates just to sort of seek solace from their friends. So I'm having a shit morning, I feel depressed, and you'd have thought that people would attract like-minded people towards that and then find some sort of comfort. And what's actually been found is that people who do post negative updates alienate people online as well. So it's this interesting mix between, well, yes, you might be more anonymous, but people still respond because we still have the same emotional urges. We want to be connecting with people who are going to improve our lives, who are going to make us feel valued or sexy or loved or whatever. On the other hand, if you look at the way that people started trolling initially on Twitter when it first came out, that's a really weird digital ecosystem, because people started self-regulating the entire community. And if you troll or if you spam on Twitter, you're screwed, you're out. People will literally close you down. And so that's another environment where people, even though they're anonymous, have to be respectful and to conform to similar rules to the ones that we'd use here. So you wouldn't come up to me and just go, "Oi, you're an ugly bitch, get off, you're talking nonsense." I hope, unless you think that I am, and I am. But on Twitter, you could. But if you did on Twitter, someone would come around and give you a clop around the ear and say, "Right, you're done, you're off. You don't diss people online." So jury's out, but there's a mixture of both, I think.
Anyone else on the panel wants to chip in?
I suppose I suppose my thought on this is probably we're not changing instinctively, as I said. I think maybe some of those instincts are being slightly exaggerated. So our desire, I mean, it's able to be amplified, I suppose. But I think that's probably why some things like books aren't necessarily going to go away, despite bookshops all closing down. We still would quite like to publish a book. You're going to publish a book, aren't you? You're going to publish a hard copy or soft copy?
I'm going digital in Christmas, but it's going to be done hard first. But I think that will go.
Okay. Well, you still want to do a hard copy, though. I think we still.
No, I don't want to do hard.
Oh, you don't. She doesn't.
My publishers.
Oh, well, publishers, good old publishers. Because I think we still need proof of the kill. You know, we want to actually show something on a shelf and say, actually, I did write that, and that was something I've left. And I think that's why we're always going to have a mixture of media. I don't think digital is going to take over everything by any means. I think we'll always, radio, video didn't kill the radio star, and I don't think any of the media have necessarily completely killed other forms. I think we're just. I'm not sure I'm rambling on this one, but I think. Oops. I suppose I don't think instincts are changing. I think sometimes being exaggerated.
I certainly think it depends on where you're talking about online behavior. So our experience on Facebook is that people are like themselves on Facebook like they are in real life. Of course, there are probably some sort of introverts who maybe act a bit more extroverted. But one sort of piece of evidence we've got for that is that we get people to answer a personality questionnaire about themselves, and then we get their friends, their Facebook friends, who they presumably, most of them know in real life, to answer a personality questionnaire about that person. So you can see what you think about yourself, and you can see what your friends think about you. And the relationship between those is very high. Friends think that you're slightly more extroverted generally than you think you are, but they're surprisingly similar. And also, we've looked at sort of, the personality data we've got, and also people's behavior on Facebook. So one thing is status updates. So we looked at the words that extroverts use versus the words that introverts use. I say we, this is done by some people in Pennsylvania State University. But extroverts use words that are extroverted. They use party, going out, seeing people, friends, all these kinds of things. Introverts talk about computers, internet, anime, sort of.
No stereotypes. So.
Well, it sounds like a stereotype, but it is. If you really want to stereotype, women use the word shopping. Men use the word Xbox, PlayStation 3, things like this. So as far as we can see, there's a match-up between the two.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I think we partially answered the question there, but it's an interesting one. There's a question from the front here, and I think we've got time for one other, so we'll come back there.
In looking at Facebook, my name's Peter Lindsay, in looking at Facebook, data from Facebook and data from LinkedIn, are we looking at data that has a built-in bias? In that I saw a thing with with Twitter a little while ago that said that Twitter is used most heavily by people in two professions: media and IT. And the other professions really don't have such a high level of use. So if you're in marketing and you want to market to media folk or to IT folk, great, but probably not to medics or to lawyers or to other professions. And then the other observation would be around your wonderful set of Facebook data. People have volunteered to do the test. Have you done any sort of meta-testing to test whether the people who volunteer to do the test are different to those who don't?
So, one thing I'll say is that, yes, there are certainly differences between people who use Facebook and people who don't. I saw some research a little while ago that said people who use Facebook are slightly more neurotic. They assume that people...
People care about what they have to say.
Exactly. What I will say, though, is that we tend to look at differences between the data set that we have. So all of our users are Facebook users. So then you have to find a kind of a theoretical reason why, for example, introverts and extroverts who use the My Personality application the differences between them are somehow different to the difference between introverts and extroverts who don't use the My Personality application. Mm-hmm. So it's quite a subtle thing, and I'm sure there are differences, but I'm not sure how big they are.
To this question about the difference in populations and population behaviours, There are differences. I mean, we had a project which we couldn't fulfill on, which was to find priests, and priests on Twitter about 2 years ago. That was a pretty small church at the time. But I think it depends what you're trying to do. I mean, yes, there may not be 100% take up of dentists on Twitter, but I can certainly get you access to 20 or 30,000 dentists on Twitter, which may well be enough for your media requirements. But what we'll start to see happening across these social platforms is that every walk of life will end up being reflected on them, but probably just not on any single platform. So yes, Twitter will spike in a particular way, and perhaps Twitter won't be particularly heavily used by lawyers. But there will be a social platform which will end up being heavily used by lawyers. And then the question is really just one about, for a company like ours, is about aggregating that data and making sense of it in some context that is relevant to all of the other platforms. But pretty much for anything that you need to do today, there's enough data and there are enough people on platforms like Twitter and Facebook.
I mean, what we found quite useful just to cope with that is that sometimes it's niche communities you need for niche. So the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, we do quite a lot of work in that industry in creating niche communities for people who just want to talk to each other about very specialist areas. That's worked very well around conferences they all go to. There's a lot of information released there, and that's a nice sort of closed niche community one can create that they can have real interaction and connection. So I suppose being Social Media Week, we need to think about the broad spectrum of what social media means and what it can be. I think niche communities seem like an area of a very good and ripe area for brands and people to look at.
I think also one closing point on the influence side is that you've got to be able to trust the information that you're using, and different people go to different platforms for different types of information. Recently I was reading up some research about numbers of how much we trust the information we're given across Twitter, Facebook and LinkedIn. What was interesting, in a self-polled study, one in which you would have to submit the answers yourself, people came up at about 16% trust the information on Facebook. It was around 23% for Twitter and 66% for LinkedIn. And the mean income of people on LinkedIn is about 50,000 a year. So you're talking in pounds. So you're talking, a lot more influence potentially if you're going to somewhere like LinkedIn, because people will trust what you have to say more and be more likely to share it out to the other networks through their Twitter accounts, Facebook, etc. So that's something to consider as well.
Okay, I'm going to get the mic, if we pass the mic back over to Farah and over there. I make a point. I think from a research point of view, sample bias is really problematic. Out in the kind of world of industry, that can actually be a good thing in a way, because if you're looking for a particular set of people, then that's what you want to understand. What influences that set of people, that's really what you want. I think the key thing when if you are working in this field is to understand what your sample bias is. And certainly a lot of the businesses that I've talked to over the last few years don't really realise they're looking at their customers that are their now customers, understand them really well, and assume that carries on to the people who are not yet that customer. And that's, you're always going to have that sampling error. It's interesting, Twitter, 2-3 years ago had a very particular kind of psychographic to it. As it's become more broadly adopted, that's kind of spread out. Now, again, 2 years ago, if you wanted early adopters, Twitter was the place to go to. So again, it can be an advantage, is just being aware of it, which is a really good point.
Can you just make a point about Twitter as well, and it's as true about Facebook, is that we just may not see the other communities that are out there. So if I look at my Twitter stream, it is basically full of tech and finance nerds, several of whom I see in this room, but we know from the data that we can see that there's a kind of entire spectrum of people on Twitter. Dentists in Saudi Arabia, as an example of a huge community we track, but also kind of skanks in LA, and artists all over the place, and craftspeople, and of course what you don't ever see as an individual is the other 200 million accounts, of which maybe 25, 30, 40 million are active. So it's quite possible to wander around thinking that everybody's really thoughtful about social media on Twitter because those are the people you follow. But actually there's a kind of whole hip-hop community out there who's, patois you just wouldn't understand. that can be addressed by brands.
How many people have ever used kind of tweets near you or done that kind of search? Okay, it's a really rapid experiment. It's very interesting insight into the people around you that you don't influence, and probably after about 5 minutes of watching, you may actually not want to influence.
It's pretty scary.
The question from
Sure.
Farhan.
Hi, my name is Farhan Rahman from Conscious Comms. My question for you guys is, the influence that you've been talking about sounds very much about personal influence with people that you already know. And I'm wondering about the element of influence of a stranger or of an outsider, because a lot of review sites, they're from essentially strangers. But sometimes you actually trust those recommendations more than of the person that's constantly telling you this is the best thing ever and you really have to get that, or you really have to join that cause, and you almost don't want to trust your own network of people that are trying to pressure you to make a decision, but actually you want to see, you know, like on Review or Amazon, those are not almost impersonal opinions of people that actually have more value in your decision making. I'm just wondering how that influence bears in kind of how we're talking about influence here.
There was a recent study done by one of the researchers for Facebook that looked at millions of users, and I can't remember the exact number, I've just been writing about it, so it's not quite fresh in my head, but it basically looked at the influence of people within your group and people who are on the periphery of your group, and which ones had more influence. And they found that novel information was more likely to come from peripheral members of your group, and therefore 10 times more likely to be shared by the group to other people. So if I knew someone who was, say, a rock climber, I don't do any rock climbing, and they tweeted something, or so I suppose on Facebook, they put on their update something that was interesting that none of my group had heard about, I'd be 10 times more likely to use that novel, unrelated person's information and send it out to my network. So there is an element there around novelty and curiosity. Yeah, there was another thing I was going to say, but I've forgotten, so...
So that's a fantastic example of just how complicated this area is. So what Nathalie's described is quite similar to the old Granovetter paper from the 70s of the strength of weak ties, which was that you were much more likely to get a date or get a job through a weak tie than the strong ties within your network, because you've actually already mined the strong ties of your network. You know what they have to say. And then the question is, well, how does that then fit with the work that Paul Dawson has put in Group, to which I referred to earlier, which was about the way that groups make decisions, or another one of Granovetter's theories, which is the threshold theory, which is that we all have a kind of level at which we'll suddenly switch on our behavior based on how the other people around us are behaving. So it's really, really complicated. And then the other point that Nathalie made, which is, why on earth would I share something about rock climbing that I've read, given that I'm not a rock climber? And there's some psychological motive, which is possibly to do with social approval that you'll get from your friends because you've just shared something kind of freakish about rock climbing that they'll all gasp at, the kind of Daily Star model of status updates. I mean, it's really, really complicated. And, you know, fortunately for companies like us, there are people, you know, like the two, you know, person on my end and the end, who will think about these problems and will settle with for you know, simpler challenges.
So, sorry, just to clarify, it wasn't actually about edge cases, because what you're talking about is people that are influencing people that know each other. Like, I'm talking about people where they're complete strangers. So you go to Amazon, you don't know the people that have reviewed this stuff, but actually the influence of that opinion is more impactful than of someone that actually knows you.
Well, except that, I mean, on Amazon, there's a test that you can run there, right? Which is, how do people respond to good reviews on Amazon from people they know compared to people they don't know? And there is, you know, I'm sure that there's been work done on looking at how people read reviews on Amazon and how they evaluate them. And Amazon gives us cues and clues, right? Top 100 reviewer, member of the Amazon Vine program, and we probably make judgments about the language, the form of words that's in a review when we decide whether to discount it or take it into consideration. But I'm guessing you have research on that.
Well, I've got personal experience on that, in that it's about expertise, I think. So when I'm reading an Amazon review or any review, I'm thinking, you know, how much does this guy actually know what he's talking about? Is he using long words that I don't know what they mean, which probably means that, you know, he knows more than I do. So, I mean, I certainly have done some decision-making research where you just tell people that this advice comes from an expert, this advice comes from a novice, and even if they don't know anything else about that, just the fact that you call them an expert means that they'll take that advice. So I definitely think there's expertise involved here, and that also works within the network. So, you know, although we talk about important people in the network in terms of who they're connected to and all this kind of things, there's also the fact that, you know, if I want to know what car to buy, I go to a certain sort of, you know, couple of friends that I have.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not influenced by sort of the whole network in general. I go to the people who know about cars.
I think there are 3 points on there as well. There's quality of the review, quantity, and then also whether or not there's this sort of piece around authority. Because we do tend to trust people who say they're not authority and not question what it is that they're actually saying. On Amazon, if we see that there are about 20 or 30 plus reviews for a certain product, we won't necessarily trawl through to read what they all have to say because it's social proof by numbers. And if there are a smaller number, sort of manageable, like around between 7 and 10 reviews that are there, we'll trawl through it ourselves to see if they're like us, and if they're like us, we can trust them because they're similar, and then we make our decisions based on that. So there are levels at which, or sort of games of numbers, at which we implement different strategies subconsciously to enable us to choose painlessly without as much effort.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, speaking of being influenced, one of the things that influences heavily is constraints. And we have a physical constraint around the use of the room. We could definitely go on all day, and sometimes I do. Thank you very much for being a fantastic and really engaged audience. Thank you to a fantastic panel. I hope you join me in thanking them. And I hope you take away this is a fascinating, rich area that's really starting to explode now. I think there's been a good few £100 worth of Amazon book recommendations made. Do follow the hashtag and look back on the hashtag. There's some very confused people trying to work out why SMW Psychology is trending and what exactly it is. And I'll tweet out a few links as well based on what people said. Thank you ever so much. Have a brilliant day. Thank you, panel.